my 115th webinar that I called How to Play for a Bind. Okay, so we are waiting for more attendees to come, and if you guys attend my webinar for the first time, please introduce yourself a little bit. Just tell me which country you are from and what's your ELO. It can be either a FIDA ELO, USCF, or just chess.com rating, or maybe your lead chess rating. Okay, so the webinar is recorded, and you can join the webinar here on Twitch or on YouTube. Okay, I see people joining. Hey guys, please let me know if the sound and video quality is good here. Okay, so let's wait a little bit. And by the way, I have a question for you. How do you understand the word bind? Oh, okay, perfect. So let me know, what do you think about the word bind? I can, yeah. Because it was difficult for me to find a good English word to translate my idea from Russian to English. And no, yeah, grip, hold the grip. This is actually the synonym. The best way to explain is just to let your opponent force to defend his position, to always stay under the pressure. So, and you know, when someone plays under the pressure, he can always make a mistake. Okay. Okay, so yeah, it is okay. A few other streamers use the same term bind to describe the strong center. Wait a sec. Probably you are talking about Maragzi system. It's not what they mean. So, for example, e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6. No, first, let's say g6, c4, then bishop g7, knight c3, knight f6. So this is called a Maragzi bind. And maybe they were explaining these e4 and c4 pawns against Sicilian. So I'm sure you can't use this word to explain the center, but you can explain it if it's about this Maragzi system. So in Russian we say Maragzi system. In English it's Maragzi bind. I don't know why, but I checked the vocabulary before, so there is a difference. Okay, fine. So what are we going to talk about? I prepared several games to analyze. The first one is played by Boris Gelfand against Luke Van Valley. So Boris Gelfand was a strong Soviet and is now a strong Israel grandmaster. So that time he was playing against one of the best players of Netherlands, Luke Van Valley. Actually, the names are written here on the bottom and on the upper side of the board. So, and this game successfully illustrates how Boris Gelfand was able to take the advantage of his just slightly better position. His main idea was just to get a better pawn structure and then successfully to realize it. And why I decided to demonstrate it, it's because this game illustrates how to increase your advantage step by step and always force the opponent to defend. Okay, maybe too much explanation. Let's start the analysis. e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. The name of this opening is Rosalima variation. G6. This is actually what Magnus Carlsen likes to play with black pieces. Castle, bishop g7, rook a1. And one of the best ideas is to play c3, d4. So that's why e5. Magnus Carlsen also plays e5. Bishop takes c6. It's always better for white to wait until they provoke. I mean, black provokes white to capture. But even if not, then why not to capture? Because if, for example, you make a slow move in this position, they can just play knight g, e to e7 and replace one knight with the other one in case if white decides to capture. So bishop c6 to ruin the pawn structure. This move, b takes c6, was played first in 1992 by Boris Spassky in the match versus Fischer. And this is where Fischer replied with b4. C takes b4, a3, and finally he decided to open the center with d4 move. He got a slightly better position and as a result won the game. Well, maybe he won because he was better than Boris Spassky that time. However, b4 looks good anyway, but if not b4, then c3 with d4. Because now the pawn is on d7 and this pawn is now a backward pawn. That's why it's in white favor to open the file. Okay, so d takes c5 here, d3, just developing pieces. This is a typical idea. Queen comes to e7. Okay, guys, what do you think? Why queen comes to e7? Why this move is important for this position? The first question for you. Okay. Yeah, it's black to move. The question was why queen e7 is a good move. To defend c5, you can defend c5, b6. So the main idea was to protect the pawn on e5. Why this pawn? Because one of the typical ideas here is to play knight f6, knight d7, knight f8, and then relocate the knight to the best place to e6. And from e6 it can jump to d4. So if you play knight f6 right away, you blunder the pawn on e5. If you instead play knight e7, then it looks like you can't improve this knight anymore and you have to maybe play g5 somehow with h6 or maybe with f6 g5. this is not what black intends to play. So the idea of queen e7 was to protect the pawn to be able to play knight f6. Knight bd2, knight f6, knight c4, attacking the pawn, knight comes to d7. This is a part of the plan. So bishop d2, then knight should move to f8. But if knight goes to f8 immediately, for example, if I play this move, what may happen after? What do you think white should do in this position? It's a kind of a mistake, actually. Bishop c3, then f6. Black is okay with it. So take on e5 first. Yeah, that's right, guys. Yeah, exactly. So first you take on e5 several times, and after queen e5 just bishop c3 and you capture the rook on h8. So here knight f8 was a mistake, that's why it's better first to castle. a3, which is a typical plan. Bishop comes to c3. b4 was still possible. Actually, a3 is played with the idea of b4, but Boris Gelfand decided it's too early. However, a5. a3. Okay, good question. So why not to play b5 in this position? Well, what can I say? b5 is an aggressive move, but then you have to defend. For example, if I play this move, then queen d6, let's say bishop a3, and then black has to defend their position. For example, f5, maybe b4. b4 can be played, c takes b4, a takes b4, and if queen takes, it's knight c6, then knight a7. So it weakens the pawn structure on the queen side and allows a strong counterplay for white. That's why not b5. So b6, bishop c3, a5, and the main idea here was to play a4 and to force the pawn to stay on b6. Every time the pawn goes to b5, you can just capture the pawn on a5 and gain it. Even if there is no knight or there is no bishop, you take once and then a5 is hanging. Oh yeah, I may write a book, but right now I have too many obligations, so I don't have enough time to write books. Actually, instead of writing books, I prefer creating courses. So, and right now I'm working on the course devoted to how to play against London system. I think this course will be published in March on Chessable. And this course is really good. I demonstrate how black can at least equalize the position, but usually they get a better position against London system. So this is how you can beat London system with black. On my channel you may also find a webinar that was devoted to this topic. Some of the lines are covered there, but of course this is a big course, and every deviation, even if it looked weird, was analyzed. Okay, so bishop a6 was played, and b3. The main idea of b3 move was to capture on c4 with the b pawn. Later you will realize why it was important. Not with the d pawn, which opens the d file, but with the b pawn, which keeps the d file closed but opens the b file. Rook fb8, g3, just a simple move. I'm not sure if this move becomes helpful in future, but with this move, potentially white can initiate a kingside attack. And that was actually kind of a waiting move. So Gelfand waited until black captures on c4, then b takes c4, and then black starts with their common plan to relocate the knight to e6. Queen c1. Queen goes to c7 to keep the protection of the pawn. So, for example, knight e6 would close the e-file, so and interfere between the queen and the e5 pawn. But queen c7, the pawn is still protected. Queen b2 attacking with, once again, now f6 is forced. And then I want you to think and try to come up with a plan that white should apply right now. What do you think white should do? Of course, they have several ideas. Yeah, I'm asking about the concrete move, but this concrete move should reveal the plan. If, for example, it's not clear what your plan is, please also mention the plan. So for those who is watching this webinar on YouTube, you can also use chat and suggest your comments. But to be able to do this, you should enter YouTube. Okay, so what do you think white should do? Who knows? Any suggestions are welcome. Knight h4 and f4. Thank you for this suggestion. So the question is, please come up with a plan for white. Okay, so one of the ideas was knight h4 and f4. So right now, of course, f4 blunders the pawn, but maybe you need some support, maybe moving the knight back and then f4, maybe moving the queen back and then f4. So yeah, sounds like a good idea, but that is not the only thing you can do here. Okay, so take advantage of the weakness. Which weakness to take the advantage of? f6. You mean to open up to be able to capture on f6 with the queen? Well, that makes sense. But if you just exchange the pawns f4 for f6 and then exchange the bishops, there will be no advantage. g4 is another attempt. So g4, yeah, that makes sense. But g4, knight e6, and the knight comes to f4, which I think is very important here. So unfortunately, g4 weakens the position too much. Okay, what other suggestions do you have, guys? No, h4, h5, of course, is the other thing, but you are mainly focused on the kingside. Kingside attack is what we definitely should do in this position, but before doing a kingside attack, what should be done first? Okay, so first of all, as I told you, it was important to capture on c4 with the b pawn to keep the file semi-open. b5 cannot be played. With this move they blunder. That's why first of all we may put the pressure on b6 with this and this maneuver. So both moves are good, rook eb1 or rook a3. Rook a3, this is what Boris Gelfand played. Knight e6, rook b3. bishop f8, and this is where Luke Van Velde offered a draw. And of course, Boris Gelfand rejected a draw because he thought he has a better pawn structure while this pawn is the object of the attack. If that pawn was on c7 protecting the b6 pawn, maybe it was an approximately equal position. But with the pawn on c6, this is a permanent weakness. So that's why let's attack it. Rook b1. Now they need one more defender, rook a6. And now when you are stuck on the queen side and you force black to defend, you should recall the principle that Aaron Nimzowitsch once announced. Who knows the main principle that of Nimzowitsch? For example, if you are stuck with your play on one side of the board, what should you do? So the principle of two weaknesses. Okay, perfect. So then you should create the second weakness and try to attack it. And this is where Boris Gelfand switches to the king side. So with moving his pieces to the b file and attacking the pawn on b6, he tried to pressure the pawn, and he also tried to tie enemy pieces down to this pawn. Now he has some room to maneuver, comparing to black, who has a lack of space, and plays queen c1 to get the queen to the king side. Bishop d6, queen f1, queen d7, and h4, with the idea of playing h5. That's why black has to play h5. So this is quite a common solution to prevent white's activity, but at the same time it limits black possibilities. Now queen h3, creating a pin. Bishop c7. The bishop is useless because most of the pawns are located on dark squares and they restrict the bishop. That's why black decided to support the pawn on b6 with their bishop on c7. And step by step, white tries to improve their position. Bishop d2. Bishop on c3 is not required here because the e5 pawn is well protected. And if only black could play f5, then the bishop better stay on c3 to attack here. But f5, at least now, is not a possible option. That's why you can relocate the bishop to move it to a better place. So rook d8. It's difficult to suggest a good plan for black. You see, they have to defend. And the reason why they only were forced to defend their position was the pawn structure and the weakness on b6. So it's a backward pawn located on the semi-open file. King h1. Oh, maybe this is where they could spend a tempo on something like that. This is the rook is no longer required on a6 while the bishop is here. But they play king h7. They believe that the king is safer there. However, it's not. This is actually a mistake. And what do you think? How did Gelfand play it on his next move? Who knows? So, okay, g4. Yeah, the plan is to play g4, but right now g4 is a mistake. For example, if g4 now, what counterplay black may find to punish white for such an early move? Yeah, you are absolutely right. It's just knight to f4. And after bishop takes, h takes g4, a fork. Queen goes back. Then pawn takes f4, and with this operation, black successfully captured the pawn on g4 and closed the position. That's why the rook is required to protect the pawn on g4. Rook g1. Now rook a8 and g4. So now h takes g4, queen takes g4 doesn't look good for black, because the plan is to play h5, for example, let's say queen f7 here, but the queen f7 loses because of h5. Now what? If g5 or even g takes h5, then queen f5 check. And if there is no pawn, white could enter their camp with rook g6. But in this exact position, after king g7, just bishop g5 to open up the position. I can show you. So taking the queen on f5 means to fall under a double check, after which the king has to move, and after e takes f5, white is winning. Fork plus several extra pawns. Rook g6 is coming as well. Rook g6, rook g7. So if after knight g5, knight takes knight, rook takes g5, and after this move, you can just play queen g4 and gain this queen on the next move due to the pin. For example, what? If king goes there, it's rook g7 immediately. If king e8, then first check, and then rook g7 pinning the queen. And if rook d6, which looks like a good idea because the rook can now block on f6, then what do you think? How white can play now to get a decisive attack? Rook g1, what do you mean? Rook g8 or what? Or rook b1? So there was a question here, but I don't speak Portugal language. That's why I can't answer. No, I speak English here. I try to speak English at least. And I hope you guys understand me well. Maybe it was a joke. Okay. So no, it's not h6, guys. You need more pieces to the join into the attack. That's why Parallax is correct about d4. Rook comes here. For example, rook f6 to stop rook f3, but rook g3 now with rook g8 and rook g7, they can't do anything. That's why h takes g4 wasn't played, and instead black had to play this move. Maybe they were thinking about this diagonal, and the pawn is pinned now. What do you think is the best move for white in this position? And actually, this position already happened, not only in the game when Boris Gelfand played it against Luc Van Velde, but also in the game between Magnus Carlsen versus Vishy Anand when they played their World Championship match in 2014. Knight g5, I think too risky. It's knight to h2 with the idea of queen e3 and queen h6. So unfortunately, I don't know why Boris Gelfand played it. He moved the king to h2. That was a mistake. H takes g4, rook takes g4. However, that mistake wasn't decisive. Knight comes there, And now white are stuck on the king side, so they move more pieces into the game. This is a kind of inaccuracy. A better option was just to play knight to g1 with the idea of moving queen to g2 and knight to h3 to cover the f4 square to prevent knight f4. Or knight e2 is a good move with the same idea to prevent knight f4. So because after this move they could just open up with the position with b5, and if queen g2 now, queen f7, c takes b5, c takes b5, a takes b5, a4, and black obtains some counterplay. Well, bishop g5 doesn't work because they are not going to capture the bishop. So bishop d6 was played here, which was actually a tempo loss. Queen g2, queen f7. And in this position it was important to relocate the knight to h3. For example, rook b1 with a tempo, they move it back, or maybe they play this move, and then you can just continue with knight g1 and then move it to h3, for example. a4, but c4 first, and then knight finally comes to h3 to cover, and no, this is where white can continue the attack. They have a passed pawn on b5, but they are mainly focused on the king side play. So that was the best that white could achieve in case if black prepares this breakout with b5 move. But they played knight to g5, and black could simply equalize the position with b5. So the idea of this rook sacrifice is if they take, then knight captures, and this is a fork. But of course nobody captures. However, Luc van Velde played bishop e7. And then Boris Gelfand realized that the best thing he can do is just to go back. Bishop f8. Now he did play rook b1. And while the bishop is here, this pawn on b6 can be protected only with the rook. So only with this move. And not with rook b8, because rook b8 is just, you can just continue with knight g1. And if you, let's say, decide to play this move, then they may obtain some counterplay with rook e8 and rook a4. So rook b1, rook a6. This is what was played. And here knight g1, bishop h6. They exchange the bishop, so we need a piece to cover the f4 square. And that piece is the knight, because if only the knight comes to f4, then g6 is protected, plus our queen is the object of the attack. So king goes to h7. What do you think white plan should be? How to continue the attack? Should we switch back to the queen side, or maybe we can do something better? What's the idea of rook f1? Oh, queen f3, I just don't understand. Queen f, knight g5. You threaten with knight g5. Okay, that looks good. Queen f3, but queen e8 can be played, so knight g5 no longer makes sense. F4. Yeah, I think f4 was the best move. However, first king h1, a kind of a prophylaxis, and after rook g7, then f4. But f4 can be played earlier. So what to do? E takes f4, knight takes f4, knight takes f4, rook takes f4. Then what? Right now this is a threat, after which the f6 pawn dies, plus white continues their attack. That's why they decide to sacrifice the pawn on b6 and join the rook. However, actually it's not a sacrifice, this is a poison pawn. Who knows what happens in case if rook takes b6. Yeah, it was easy. Just queen to c7, which creates a fork and one of the rooks is lost. So queen f2 first. Now rook b6 is the threat. But protecting this pawn means to lose the pawn on f6. So rook f8, rook b6. Queen c7. Now doesn't make much sense. Rook comes back to b1 and again joins the king side. So queen e5 was played, and the best option was to continue with rook f1 to pressure here. For example, rook g f7. And what do you think? How to continue? What is our last step, which makes the enemy king weaker? h5, exactly, it's h5. h5, what happens then? If g5, then rook f5, queen goes to e6, and you can just capture on c5 if you want. Maybe first king g2 and then capture all the pawns. What else? If queen takes h5, it's easy, just rook h4 and you gain the queen. If g takes h5, rook f5, and then the king is exposed. So rook f1 was the best, but h5 was played immediately, and this is where it matters which exactly move to play. So for example, king g8, which was the best option, led to h takes g6, rook g6, rook f5. Now check. King g1 and queen c3. So white is definitely better, but there is no clear victory. What happened in the game? In the game, they took with the with the g pawn immediately, and after rook f5, the game was lost. However, it was better if this rook would stay on f7. Then there would no such a move like there will be no such a move like queen e8, which protects on h5, because the rook would block. In this position, this move exists, but white continues with queen c5, adding some pressure. King h6, joining the rook, now threatening to take here. Queen g6, supporting the f6. Check on e3. King h7, queen h3. So they have to play king h6 to protect. What do you think white should play next in this position to get an absolutely winning position? They are actually already winning. The task is only to prove it. Okay, so I'm waiting for more suggestions. Okay, who can suggest anything else? Nobody. Okay, yes, e5 is correct. e5, and it's time to resign due to the pin. They played rook gf7, queen a3 check, and queen h f3 was the last move, after which they resigned, because this pawn is lost and then the game is over. Or in case of king h6, just rook f6 to exchange all the material. Rook takes, queen takes, or yeah, queen takes, or you can capture with the pawn to make the king weaker. I think this is better, but even queen f6 was good enough. This position is completely winning. And then just d4, c3, d5, and so on. Okay, so you see, at every moment of the game, white was better. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is a good game, and I wish it was mine, but no, it was one of the top grandmasters, Boris Gelfand. So at every moment of the game, white was better, and white was putting the pressure. Their main benefit was just a better pawn structure, which obtained here after bishop takes c4 was played. Looks like not an inaccuracy, but actually a strategic mistake. After that, white pressured black. So they first tied enemy pieces to the b6 pawn and then switched to the king side, trying to increase their advantage always, step by step. And you see, black couldn't find a good plan with any counterplay. They couldn't open the position, they couldn't play f5 because it's either e5 being hanging or the pawn on f5 was hanging, or the king was too exposed. Which year the game was played? In 2003. Okay, the next game I think is maybe even more interesting because this is the game between Boris Gelfand and Garry Kasparov. So that time, Garry was the best player. Actually, I'm sure he is the best player of all time. If Magnus Carlsen becomes a world champion for maybe 4 or 6 more years, then of course Magnus will be the best player of all time. But that time it was Garry, and everyone struggled playing against him. What happened here? Let's start. d5, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e7. So the idea of bishop e7 is to prevent bishop g5. So for example, those who play knight f6, they usually face with this move, or maybe with c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop g5 here. For example, bishop e7, e3, then castle, queen c2, c6, bishop d3, knight d7, knight g2, rook e8, castle, knight goes there, then f3 with the idea of playing e4. And nowadays this position is considered to be slightly better for white. Here white wins more often. But if you play bishop e7, then bishop g5 cannot be played. That's why white has to develop their bishop to f4. If, for example, white plays another move, knight f3, which is also quite common for this position, then white rejects to play Carlsbad. So c takes d5, e takes d5, and bishop comes to f4, knight to f6, e3, this time bishop f5. This is not the best plan actually, and maybe that time when the game was played, actually I don't remember which. Okay, let me tell you when the game was played. The game was played in 1994, and yeah, so the game was played in 1994, and that time the position was considered to be okay. But nowadays queen b3 offers some advantage. Boris Gelfand knew that, but didn't play this move because just decided to play a different line when he was more comfortable. Knight g2, castle, knight g3, bishop comes to e6, bishop d3, c5, the counterplay which actually forces black to play with an isolated pawn. Castle, knight c6, rook c1. And this is actually quite a common position. The first game in this position was played in 1935 between Sala Flor and José Raúl Capablanca. That time Capablanca played the best option. What do you think? What is the best move for black in this position? What do you think? Yes, guys, thank you for your suggestions. Yes, d4 is the best move, and actually this is one of the ideas to get rid of an isolated pawn. So most of the games here end in a draw. However, Garry Kasparov played bishop d6. Knight g2 to protect the bishop. Now d4 looks like a blunder. What's wrong with d4 move? What do you think? No, Gary didn't play d4, of course. Yeah, it's because of bishop d6, queen d6, and knight b5. Then the d4 pawn is hanging because, let's say, queen goes there, knight d4, knight d4, knight d4, and that's it. So rook c8 was played. Rook c8, bishop b1. A typical idea is to play queen d3 and threaten h7, even if it's not hanging. Bishop f4, knight takes f4, and this is where they played a mistake. So again, here, like something like queen d6 looks good. Maybe d4 is also good in this position, but they played bishop g4, which wasn't the best maneuver. After f3, the bishop retreats back. Queen d2. And after that, they played queen to e7. What happens in case of d4? Who knows? Yeah, knight e6 first, f takes e6 because the queen is hanging. So, for example, this move is a blunder, queen takes queen, then knight takes rook. So, knight e6, f takes e6, knight e4. And white is better. Because of a better pawn structure, e6 is now the object of the attack. So d4 doesn't work, that's why queen e7 was played, and knight b5. So you know, one of the basic principles of how to play against an isolated pawn is first to immobilize the pawn, then exchange minor pieces and try to attack this weak pawn on d5. a6, knight comes to d4, and exchanging pieces, especially minor pieces, is not in black favor. Knight comes to e5, b3 to cover this square. This is where black could consider the idea of exchanging major pieces. Queen c2, attacking the bishop. Queen d8, the queen has to protect both. And knight h5, trying to distract the knight. If knight captures, then queen h7, queen h5, white is winning. If knight h5, here knight e d7 looks good, but actually white position looks better because black is stuck. They have to defend. For example, white can just simply play king f2, which improves their position in general. Maybe something like b4, a4, and so on. And black doesn't have any good moves that improve their position. Okay, so rook c1 actually led to a better position for white. Bishop d7 was played by Garry Kasparov. g4. So the position is semi-open, but there is only one file that is open. That's why, because of the domination in the center, Boris Gelfand decides to pressure the enemy knight with g4 and then g5 move. For example, if h6, then h4. But maybe that was the best option. Knight g6 was played by Garry. And white decided to retreat, to make the knight the object of the attack. However, the position isn't so bad. At least getting the knight back was a good idea, but knight e8 was played by Garry, and that was actually a mistake. What do you think? What white should do in this case? It's not a blunder, just a strategic mistake. So rook c8, right? Bishop takes c8, and then rook c1, activating the rook. No, knight f5 is too early. And if this is what exactly happened in the game. So, for example, if bishop comes to d7, then maybe queen e5, entering their camp and attacking the pawn on d5. Queen e5, queen b4, attacking b7, b5. But actually, this move restricts the bishop and creates another weakness on a6. So knight d6 was played. And this is the moment where Garry Kasparov blundered. But you see, he blundered because he was playing under the pressure. And he couldn't find the way how to improve the position, how to impose his playing style. Because Garry is good with calculations, tactics, attacks. But when he is forced to defend, he is not as good as when he attacks. Maybe no, that time, of course, he was a better defender. I mean, a better defender than anybody else. But his best skill is attacking, calculating, and creation. Okay, so how to play? What did Garry blunder here? This is where white gains the material. Actually, Garry liked to play King's Indian defense. So as for the isolated pawn, no, he actually played all types of the positions, but he was really good in King's Indian defense. So knight f5 doesn't make much sense. So if you play knight f5, let's say, what's the purpose? Just bishop f5, g takes f5, little knight goes to the center, Or what was the idea of knight f5? Queen a5 attacking here. That makes sense, but I don't think that this is a good move. Let's say knight h4 maybe. I'm trying to pressure the pawn. No, the queen should stay on d2. It does some defensive function. It protects the pawn on e3. Okay, so bishop takes g6. This is what Gary blundered. And after knight f4, it's not easy to save the pawn. Almost nothing works. For example, bishop e6 is a blunder because of knight d takes e6 and then knight takes g6. Such move like queen g5 also is in white favor, for example, after rook c7. Rook c7, what they can do? Maybe this move, then queen c1, putting some pressure on c8, or maybe just h3 first. So and then our task is to attack the pawn on d5, which they can't protect. But here, for example, such an attractive move like rook c5 is a mistake. Who can tell me why rook c5 here is a mistake? Knight e4 right away, but there is a pawn here. Yeah, bishop g4 first. That's right. F takes g4 and now knight e4. So after the queen moves, it's queen to g4 with a strong attack. Knight g2, knight c5, queen c5, and let's say rook c8. White is not losing, but black has a strong attack. And this is where Gary could succeed. However, he didn't play queen g5. Instead, he realized that he loses the pawn on d5 anyway. Let's activate the pieces. So you see, he tried to find a counterplay in this position. Knight d5, queen g5. Knight f4, which is okay move. Queen e5, putting some pressure here. Knight g2 and g5 fixes the pawns on the king side. Queen comes to b4. Knight takes b5 to exchange the central knight. Knight takes knight. Queen d4. With extra pawn, you should pass the game into the endgame to realize your advantage. Queen e7. Queen c5 is a good move, attacking everything. And then queen takes b5. Now f3 is not hanging because the rook is hanging. After rook d8, everything was good. But queen e2 is okay move. However, then white started making the mistakes. But the game is completely winning. So such a strong grandmaster as Boris Gelfand outplayed the world champion Garry Kasparov. And this is where we'd better end our analysis. And this is a good game that represents how white should play. And actually, let's sum it up, and only then we continue the analysis. We continue the game, I mean. So first of all, white is completely winning with 2 extra pawn, and they should defeat. They should probably play this move, get the knight to f5, or maybe exchange the rooks and get the knight to d5. Then they should exchange the rooks, activate the queen, move the king to the center to e2 or e3 probably. Exchanging at least one pair of pieces leads to absolutely winning position. But this is not what this is not what Boris Gelfand played. Okay, so let's now look at the game from the very beginning to the end. So here everything was okay, but the pawn is a weakness, and black tried to defend it. They didn't play d4 in time, that's why now they have to defend it. Queen e7, then the pawn was blocked, and because of a stable center, white decided to initiate some counterplay on the king side. Not a counterplay, but just the second the second weakness. So they attacked the pawn on d5, and then they decided to switch to the king side and initiate the attack there, because their pieces are looking at that side. That was okay. Finally, they were able to capture the central pawn, and black had no counterplay. Okay, so one pawn, then the other pawn on b5, two extra pawns, a completely winning position with no chances for black, but somehow Gary obtained these chances. Queen f2. No, I think the reason was because of Gelfand. He maybe was too tired at the moment. He played queen f2, which is just a tempo loss. Rook comes to d3, and then black starts black develops their initiative. So here, for example, knight e1 could allow white to continue to play with the advantage. The rook has to go back, but Gelfand played h4. G takes h4, knight h4. The knight is now located too far from the place of action. And such a move like queen d8 offers approximately equal position with rook d2. So this initiative could compensate a pawn loss. Maybe even two pawn losses. For example, rook c2, rook d1, king g2, and queen comes to g5, threatening with a sacrifice. Or no, not immediately, but threatening with with a sacrifice maybe two, but with f5 at least. Gary played g5, kind of a mistake. Knight goes to g2. Queen e5, activating the queen, and queen c2. That move was actually a critical mistake, after which the position becomes equal. Just queen d6 with the idea of rook d2. Now neither rook c2 nor rook d1 can be played. Knight e1 is the only thing left, but then one of the pawns is lost. Queen f2. However, queen e5. Knight g2, rook comes to e2, and the pawn on the flank is hanging now, but Gelfand suggests to exchange the rooks. This is the only thing he could do actually. If he moves the queen, he loses this one. So rook e1, rook takes f2, rook takes e5, rook takes f3. So no extra pawns, but the g5 can be captured. f6 is not an option, so this pawn dies anyway. Bishop d7, rook g5, king f8, and after knight f5, Gary just exchanged and they agreed to a draw. You know that even with extra pawn in the rook end game, you can draw the game. So here, for example, this is a draw because rook c3, rook c1, and rook c2 to capture the pawn can be played, and black gains the material back. However, first of all, they have to play king e7, and actually with this move they can attack the rook and the pawn together. So two ideas, this and rook c3, rook c1, rook c2 to capture the other pawn on the other flank. Okay, so unfortunately white made a mistake and couldn't realize their advantage, but you see, he did everything to get a winning position, and he was pressuring his opponent. He was blocking the isolated pawn. Finally he won it. Oh, okay, he was blocking the pawn, then he initiated a kingside attack, and because of these two ideas, black always had to defend. Finally Gary decided to give up the pawn, but to obtain some counterplay, which he was lucky at. But if white plays properly, the game would end in white's favor. Okay, so what can you learn from this game? That you always should create threats if only your position is slightly better. Take the advantage of your better position, so realize what is your main benefit and how to exploit it. Here the main benefit was the isolated pawn on d5 that can be attacked, and then when white pieces were stuck with attack on the pawn, the other thing that white could do was their activity on the king side, because of this bishop, because of the knights being attacking and the queen close to h7. Here white combined the ideas of queen c2, queen h7, and just a pawn march. Okay, fine. The last game that I want to show is this one. This is actually a game fragment. Jose Raul Capablanca was playing against Karel Treibal. You see, here white pressures black on the king side, but an exchange of the pawns doesn't offer anything. It just equalizes the position maybe. What are your suggestions? Okay, there was a question about e4, about the last game. I can answer it a little bit later, okay? So knight d2, but what's the idea of knight d2? Queen b2 to maintain the... Yeah, queen b2 makes sense actually. But all the pieces are concentrated on the king side except the queen. So probably it means that you should play on the queen side. And then when all the pieces are on the king side, he plays this move. Why this move? Because no, a takes b5. Here a takes b5 is a good move. If something like rook a8, then just h6. And if king goes to the back rank, the connection between rooks is lost, and queen just captures the rook, and that's it. Or they have to sacrifice on h6. But actually, after a takes b5, g takes h5 can be played first, and if, let's say, this move, then rook a8 looks good. Right? No. Wrong. If rook a8 in this position, then I don't know what is best. What do you think is best in this case? Rook h7. Rook h7 is not the best, but rook h7 deserves attention. Rook h7, rook h7, and after king takes, just queen e8. White gained the pawn and is winning in this position. So, but the best move here is actually queen takes on a8, and after rook takes a8, rook h7, if king g6, it's just b6 first. Queen has to move to the back rank, right? Queen d8, let's say. And then knight e5, knight takes knight, and a checkmate on h6. If king goes to g8, b6, queen goes to the back rank, and g6 in this position with the idea of rook h8. So b5 was played. What if g takes h5? H6. Okay. What if black plays h6? Okay. H takes g6. What then? King takes g6. Maybe knight h4, king goes to g7, then g6, knight goes there, and just let's take the pawn. Or what else can be played? This move, and then knight comes to the center. Then another attacker is required. For example, rook h5, and queen somehow joins h3, and then the pawn is captured. They can't defend. So b5, a takes b5, h6. This is what Capablanca played, but it wasn't obligatory. Instead, a takes b5 worked as well. But with this move, king has to go to f8, and the rooks are now stuck. A takes b5, king e7 to let the rooks escape. But then b6, and the queen has to go to the back rank. With rook a1, white absolutely dominates on the a file. So black has only play moves, some moves, and wait. Queen b4, rook hd8, rook a7, then the other rook comes. So you see, white closed the position on the king side and moved all their pieces to the queen side, preparing for a kind of a tactical strike. Activating the king to h4 to be able to have a better endgame in case if somehow the game transposes to it. King g8. They were just repeating the position, but finally knight comes to a5 to capture on b7. However, knight d8. What do you think was the next move? Well, before playing h6, you should definitely realize if you can create some real problems on the queen side, because if not, then this is a kind of a fortress. Yes, that's right. Here the best move is bishop to a6. The pawn is hanging, they can only capture. Rook d7, rook e7. And finally, rook takes there to be able to gain another pawn on c6. And then black resigned. Why? Because white gains the exchange back, plus the pawn on a6 is hanging, so with two extra pawns already advanced, the game is over. When rook a8? Rook a8 didn't work. No, in this position, no, it's not possible. Rook a8, queen a8. What's the point? If you then want to deliver something like that, I think just this move is good, and then rook takes a8. They have enough material to compensate, more than enough material. No, it's a blunder. So here, when you pressure your opponent on one side of the board, you should switch to the other side and take the advantage of your better position, which in this position, your main advantage was extra space. Okay, there was a question about previous game, why Boris Gelfand didn't play e4. When? Maybe here e4. yeah, here e4 was good. Instead of queen c2, here e4 was the best move. Queen d6, rook e1, and then after this move it was possible to play this rook e2, and in case of rook d1 there is no need to move the rook back and repeat the position, but you can just play knight to e1. This is where white is better and can continue playing for a win. Okay guys, so this is how I demonstrate how to take your advantage if you have only one small benefit. In this position, that was a better pawn structure. Here in this game, it was the isolated pawn on d5, which became the object of the attack, plus a potential for the kingside attack. And here extra space and several weaknesses such as b7, a6 and c6 into the enemy camp after b6. Okay, that was enough for today. So those of you who are looking for private classes can email me at tricksofchess@gmail.com. I type it here in the chat. Please don't miss my next webinar that is going to be conducted next Sunday, same time. What else? So this is my chess.com account. So you can send me a friend request. Actually, a new article was added to my website, so if you are interested in it, you can read it. It's called An Underestimated Motive. And finally, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'll share the link just a sec. Do you have any questions? If you have any suggestions about the next webinar, about the topic, you of course may email me, or you can suggest it now. If not, then thank you for joining and hope to see you next Sunday. Also, you may invite everyone, your friends or just people you are playing with usually. Yeah, I'm also thinking about the simul. Maybe the next one will be a simul. So thank you for your attention and we'll meet next Sunday.